for coming to our first workshop, which is focusing on survey design and survey questions, which we know a lot of you are dealing with. So I'd like to begin firstly by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are, the traditional custodians of the land in which we're all meeting. I'm on the Wurundjeri land of the Kulin Nation. Josh is somewhere else. And we'd like to pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And we recognise that we're all coming from different lands. I can see that we've got people from all over the country. So today, Josh, who many of you know, is going to be taking us through the art of survey question design and what an art it is. Or is it a science? It is a bit of both, and there is no right or wrong in some circumstances. People will interpret things the way they will. So many of you do know Josh, but for those of you who don't, he's an early career public health researcher with an interest in epidemiology and biostatistics. I talk about Josh as being my right-hander, my left-hand man. And we work very closely together on ECA Australia. He joined the disease elimination program here at Burnett in 2019. And you've all probably come into contact with him with his work with regards to monitoring and evaluation. So over to you, Josh.
Great. Thank you so much, Jacqui. And hi, everybody. Before I begin, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I live and work, which I'm right on the border of the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. And I'd also like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So before we begin, let's do some housekeeping stuff. So the way that this is going to run is it's going to do 2 or 3 slides. Then everyone's going to be split up into some breakout rooms. There's going to be an ECA member who's going to facilitate those rooms, share some slides with the activity, and give you about 5 to 10 minutes to have a crack at doing the activities in your groups, and then bring everyone back and do a few more slides, then another activity. If you have any questions as we go, feel free to post them in the chat, and Anna Wilkinson's going to screen the questions and answer them. And then for the really good questions, what our plan was to answer them fully afterwards and then send out a kind of group email with just some explanation and building on those questions. Cool. All right, let's get started. So I wanted to start by just going through the 2 kind of main types of survey questions that you're probably used to seeing that we often come across. So the first type is open-ended or free text questions. So open-ended questions are good because they allow participants to answer the questions in their own words, usually any way that they like, which is really valuable for finding out information that might be new or that you might not have considered when you were writing the question. They're really powerful questions, but they are time-consuming for participants to answer, and they're also quite time-consuming to analyse. And so if you want to maximize the impact of these types of questions, then you should use them as sparingly, well, not as sparingly as possible, but don't overuse them. For closed questions, so this is the most common type of survey question, and you're probably very used to seeing them. So a closed question has a predetermined set of responses to a question. They're really, really good for creating specific, relevant, comparable data, and it can also be used to give the survey a kind of nice structured flow. There's many different types of closed questions. So you can have binary, which is like yes or no questions. You can have multiple choice questions where you're only allowing participants to answer one of a given set of responses, or you can have checkbox style questions where you're allowing participants to answer to many of the responses, the predetermined responses. Cool, so I wanted to come up with a kind of suite of my hot tips for how to write a good question and characteristics of a good question. And I whittled it down to 8 points. So the first point is that I think a good question shouldn't be too long. You don't want to read a whole paragraph before you answer a question. So this will reduce, a question that isn't too long will reduce some of the burden for participants. You want to have a question that's that's really specific and clear about what's being asked. You want to use really clear language. So avoid being overly floral or verbose in your language, because that just makes you look a bit ostentatious sometimes. And you want to make sure that the question that you're asking is relevant to, I've said here survey question, but really the survey aim or the research question that you're trying to answer. Number 5, so a good question should only ask one thing. So a question that is asking people whether they're excited and happy is going to cause, first of all, the participants some sort of like confusion, but then also yourself some confusion later down the track when you're trying to analyze it and you've got a bunch of people who are happy and excited. You want it to mean mean the same thing to everyone. So if you've got 2 people who answer the same question, but to each of these people, the question is kind of asking a different thing, then you're actually measuring 2 different things, which will make comparing those 2 people really difficult. And avoid using double negatives as much as possible. So double negatives are confusing to read and they're also just bad writing. So just a hot tip for the future, don't use double negatives, try to avoid double negatives where possible. And they're my 8 tips for a good survey question. So now that we have quickly gone through my 8 tips on how to write a good question, we're going to split you guys up into your breakout rooms where everyone can have a go at matching each of these questions with an issue. So at the moment, it's all out of order. So just have a crack in your breakout rooms at matching each of the questions with an issue. The activity should hopefully take about 5 to 10 minutes. So in your breakout rooms, if you could just introduce yourself, say where you're from, and then this facilitator will help everyone to have a crack at matching these up.
Josh, can I just check, and are there any questions on those 8 tips? Anybody seen double-barreled questions? You see them all the time, don't you? You don't quite know which one to, they're my particular favourite, as Josh said, when you're happy and excited. I have attached the notes, which is how I spend that's my general disposition, happy and excited most of the time. I have attached the PDF of these to the invitation that was sent refreshed last night. If you don't have them, please just let me know. But I will now open up the breakout rooms and let's go.
Okay, and pretty intuitive how to do that activity. I'll just quickly go through the answers. So, are you not against increasing taxes is a double negative. Number 2 was a leading question. Number 3 was not specific. So, have you bought anything? Isn't referring to anything in particular. Physically fit can mean different things to different people. And informative and practical is asking 2 things. So, if your survey question done and you're happy with it, then in the case of an open-ended question, it's pretty straightforward because you can just leave a free text box and people can answer it any way that they like. But in the case of a closed question, then you've got to design some survey response options, which people underestimate but are actually surprisingly difficult to do. So what I've done is I've created 5 key characteristics similar to the design of a question, but in this case, the design of the response options, the 5 key characteristics for a really good set of response options. So a good question response option should provide context to help the participant answer the question. They should be comprehensive. So if you're asking people how many days in a week that they smoke, it's probably good to include up to 7 days, not just up to 3. They should be consistent in as many ways as possible. So it should be consistent in the language that you're using. It should be consistent in the length of the question and the length of the response options. And then also, if you're asking people to answer it in a kind of numerical, categorical way, then the size of the categories should also be consistent. So increments of 10, increments of 20, increments of 30, rather than switching between increment sizes. They should not overlap. So what I mean by this is, I'm not sure if you guys have ever seen this, but I see this quite a lot. Is sometimes you'll get a set of response options and it might go, what age are you? And it might ask 20 to 30 and then 30 to 40. And if you're 30 exactly, then you'll fit actually across 2 categories. So it's important to make sure that the response options are actually distinct from each other. And then try to keep them logically ordered. So if you're going from 1 to 10 or 1 to 5, go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Don't go 1, 3, 4, 2, 5, which is all pretty intuitive things, but also it's important to bear them all in mind at once when you're writing a set of response options, and just kind of take note of it and reflect on the survey response options and make sure that you haven't done any of these 5 deadly sins. Cool. So now we're going to move into activity 2. So this one should hopefully only take,
Yeah, Josh, I was just going to say, Anna's put something in the chat there about, a discussion that you guys had in your breakout room. I'm just wondering whether can you just share what you were talking about with the group, Anna, about how you provide this feedback?
Yeah, thanks, Jacqui. So we just had a little bit of a chat where sometimes a colleague will come to you with their survey design and their survey questions, and it's really difficult to give constructive feedback, obviously, to colleagues, but sometimes it's really helpful if you actually base that feedback on these principles. So if you can say things a bit more constructive than just, oh, this doesn't quite make sense. If you could say something like, if you could underline the words that are a double negative and say, this is where I think it's a double negative. Or, for example, the informative and practical, you could highlight this to say, well, these are 2 adjectives joined by an and, which makes me think this is actually double-barreled. Or, say things like, the physically fit one, I think, is a really good example where you could say, well, I interpreted this question as, I'm able to walk for 30 minutes. Do you think everybody would interpret this the same? So sometimes it's really helpful to have these principles when you're giving feedback to someone else on a survey.
Yeah, and we talked about in our group, Bianca gave the example of their staff survey where they ask, questions around best practice. And they say, so best practice to you and to me means different things. It's also a difficult concept to actually define. So, sometimes you do see when people are trying to explain those concepts that can be interpreted differently, you do see them almost becoming a bit leading as well. In the definition. So it's very much something you've got to practice. And I think I just really like that idea, Anna, of bringing up ways of sharing this information, because it is an art to being able to write a survey question that's really clear, and you're not always going to get it. I was saying in my group before too, I had my COVID vaccine and the Department of Health sent me a text message, and there was a double-barreled question, and I actually couldn't answer the question because I had both a yes and a no, and I point that out. So in the open text box, I gave them a little bit of feedback on their survey design. Are there any other thoughts about the first breakout? Or Josh, can you just go back to the previous slide about the what were these five deadly sins? Gosh.
This one here.
Yeah, that one.
Yeah, I wish I hadn't used that phrase. I don't know why I said that. As soon as I
said it, it's a good one.
God,
the 5 deadly sins
to say.
of survey design.
We're just trying to come up with something that sounded witty, and it just ended up sounding stupid. But
no, I think
the effort was there.
One of the things I link this with logically ordered is one of my pet hates is when you are asked questions across the page and then down the page. And, and so sometimes you'll be, and it just looks a little bit chaotic. And I guess I'm to these days about, we don't really tend to get into that anymore with SurveyMonkey because it's all online, but paper surveys can, so that logically ordered and making sure it's consistently laid out.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many there's so many ways that you can get a question wrong. It's like I think we've probably all written a bad survey question before.
Absolutely.
I think most of the time, like, you know, even a question that's not perfect, there'll still be a lot of information and value you can get out of it. So it's not like, you very rarely have to actually not use data that you collect. It's just about being really clear about what the question is and what the data looks like and what it's actually measuring, I think, and trying to avoid these kind of survey design issues where you can.
That's right.
A little bit key lesson.
Any other thoughts? Should have seen my high school survey project on Lindy Chamberlain. Well, there you go. That is a new topic for next webinar. When Lindy Chamberlain, and you managed to have a survey in that. Were you surveying attitude towards Lindy Chamberlain? Did she do it? Wow. Did Lindy Chamberlain? Yes. Okay. Let's see where that's going, Anna. Rightio, let me put you back into your breakout groups and
is everyone clear on what the activity? Maybe I'll just clarify.
Yep.
I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory, but try and have a crack at rewording the question itself and then the survey response options as well.
And if you finish early, feel free to exit the breakout group and come back, because Josh is just sitting here by himself. So
yeah, we
don't want Josh feeling lonely.
And because Jacqui's in a breakout room, I can't talk to Jacqui.
You don't get a chance to talk anyway, Josh, because I'm talking. So
yeah, that's true.
I'll open all the rooms and that should happen.
Looks like everyone's coming back, actually. It's all good.
So I have a number of learnings that I'm desperate to share, Josh.
Well, I'm desperate to hear them, Jacqui. We do have some people who have to drop off at 11. So because we have one more activity, do you think, I would actually really like to hear your learnings.
Yeah. Well,
maybe
so
a couple of minutes.
Just sharing. Oh, look, there's Nafisa. We can see Nafisa now. So one of the big things with that activity for us, Josh, was you have to have some understanding of how often people do go shopping. So there's no point in saying, how many times do you go grocery shopping per week if the number of people who go shopping is fortnightly? You know, so it has to come from some sort of evidence base. So you can't just start randomly. Like, I know nothing about indoor plants, so I wouldn't be able to write a survey on, or survey questions on indoor plants without having to do some research to be able to the responses.
Yeah, if it was a survey on killing indoor plants, I'll get you to. Sorry.
Yes, Josh, very well tasked in that area.
There's two behind you, Jacqui, that unless fake look quite alive. So
that's because I haven't touched them, Bianca. I'm not allowed to touch them.
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent point, which is kind of, you know, the value in bringing in someone with expertise in a certain content area as well when you're writing a survey. It's
to get those response options right, though, isn't it? Because then Rob, Bianca, and I were talking about other. So what if somebody's shopping every second day and that's not there? Then you put other, and then how do you, like, what do you do with that information if it's only one person? You know, there's it makes it quite complicated.
Well, if you've got half your respondents selecting other, then that's a good indication that it wasn't a comprehensive suite of response options as well. Awesome. So we've kind of talked about how to write a question itself and how to do response options. I just want to make sure that everyone's aware of this idea of standardized questions, standardized surveys or standardized questionnaires. So standardized questionnaires are sort of the sets of questions that are measuring a certain construct or trying to measure a specific thing that have been put together by researchers and then actually validated in a kind of research setting. And so the value of them is that they're already written for you. It's like, I think, the number one value. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel. And because they are validated, you know that it's a reliable way of actually measuring a specific construct. So there's a huge amount of value in using standardized questions And it's a really good thing to know about, because sometimes if you are trying to measure something tricky in a particular population that you're not familiar with, or you're not feeling totally comfortable, you can look through some resources and try and find some previously validated tools. Another key advantage is that if enough people are using the same validated tool or instrument, then you can make comparisons as well with other people, which is a really powerful thing in certain settings. One thing that I definitely want to draw attention to, though, is that the way that these tools are tested and validated is that they're done in a kind of controlled setting with the same ordering of the questions and a specific wording of the questions. So if you change any of the wording or any of the ordering in any of the questions, you lose that kind of validation from the testing that's been done. Another thing as well that's not on this slide, but it's that sometimes validated tools have a copyright issue. So you actually have to pay for them, but there's still literally thousands and thousands of free tools that are available for lots of different purposes. Once we've got our survey sorted and we want to apply it into practice, there's some pretty simple steps that you can take just to make sure that it flows correctly and there's not too many issues, and people actually know what they're doing and how they're meant to answer questions. And I think the number one thing that I always do before I send a survey out is I'll get one of my colleagues or multiple colleagues to go through and actually test the survey before I actually start collecting real data. You want to make sure that the survey is just really clear and easy to read. There's enough white spaces so that it's not looking really cluttered and messy. Participants are really clear about how they're meant to answer questions. So especially if you're using more complex style questions like matrix questions or ranking questions, sometimes that can get a little confusing. So putting just a little description before the question on how participants can answer it can go a long way in making sure you're getting accurate data. And when you're distributing surveys, make sure that you're using a method that's going to reliably get the survey out to the people you want it to reach. So sending it by mail may not be the best option, especially if you've got, a GP or a population that's moving around. And that brings us to activity 3. So just seeing a bunch of messages in the chat, so I'm just going to quickly. Cool. This is an opportunity. This is kind of like an extension question. So this is an opportunity for everyone to have a go at drafting their own question from scratch. I have a kind of hypothetical survey, which is looking at measuring the effect of COVID-19 on people's health. And one of the specific questions in this survey that I'm looking to write is asking people to report how easily they could access healthcare in the past 3 months. So you can do this question any way you like in your breakout rooms. So hopefully this will start a conversation around the right way to approach this question and how you could possibly do it. So yeah, I think maybe 5 minutes again should be enough time for us to finish by 11. So if you could go into your breakout rooms and have a crack at this one.
The answers for this, but any thoughts? Lucy, I can see Lucy talking, but Lucy, you talking to us? You're on mute. It did go quickly, Emily Adams. 5 minutes flies when you're having fun.
Did everyone get an opportunity to get a question and some answers out, some response options out?
We actually ended up talking, Josh, about how do you write questions that about intention to change. The very difficult. Anna's saying here that they have necessary healthcare.
Yeah.
Chat about what is necessary healthcare. So that's
this is a pretty tricky.
We all understand. Yeah.
This is a pretty tricky question to ask, really, because there's just so many kind of potential issues with the way that you can ask this type of question. So what I will share is that we actually have a study at the Burnett, which is our optimized study, which is looking at effects of COVID-19 on people's lives. And they have a question which is looking to ask this exact thing, which is on the following slide. So this is the way that it was drafted. So the question was, how easy was it for you to access the healthcare you need in the past 3 months? And as Anna's pointed out, the healthcare you need could mean different things to different people. So it's not to say that this is a bad question. It's just that just trying to make a point that there's not really one right way of doing a question, and there's no such thing as the perfect question. As long as you're really clear about what the question is and what the response options are, though, you can normally get quite a lot of value and information out of questions. So hopefully that kind of reiterates just how difficult it can be sometimes to write a question, and how sometimes you need to actually reframe what the aim of the question is or what it is that you're trying to measure.
And Josh, there's probably a question around how you're defining access. So is it that I can get there easily, or it's available in the hours that I need it? So there's when I read that, yeah, tricky.
That's actually a really good point. I hadn't even thought about that, but that's completely true as well. And access might mean different things, as in some people might be like, I've only been doing telehealth for the last 6 months. And in their mind, that might mean that they haven't been able to access the healthcare they need. But maybe the way that we're meaning it when we're writing the question is that telehealth counts as access. So we're not actually measuring what we want to measure. So that's a really good point. I hadn't even thought about that. These are all things to think about when you're writing a question. You can easily go down a rabbit hole.
Josh, Kimberly's just pointed out too, and there's a question there that this doesn't have an option for no easy or difficult or no change. And is that because that's an ambiguous option? No change.
I think it's because the purpose of the question wasn't actually about change. So if you think about it, so the optimize, sorry, Josh, I just jumped in. Optimize is a longitudinal cohort study. But if you think about when you ask someone a question, you're just asking them about the past 3 months. It's a point in time. So you have to remember also your study design and what you're giving people at that point in time. But you're right, someone might interpret this as a change question, but it's not. It's actually just tell me about this point in time. I think because we've said 3 months, it feels like we want to know about a longitudinal change, but we actually don't. So we want you to aggregate the past 3 months and say, on the whole, for this particular period, what's it been like? We do this quite often in surveys. So we ask people about the last 7 days, the last month, since we last saw you, the last 3 months. But I think, yeah, it's a really good point that's been raised, because I've never thought about it before. I just kind of assumed that participants would understand we're asking about a static time point. But when you add in a component of time, people are probably wondering, oh, you want to know what's different over the past 3 months. So interesting. I never thought about that.
Yeah, some participants might read that and assume that it's asking, is it easier now compared with 3 months ago? That might be the way that they interpret it, even though that's not really what we're trying to ask. So yeah, lots to think about. Interesting stuff. Cool. This takes us pretty much to the end, which is pretty much perfectly on time. Just some 4 kind of summary points that I've put together. And who's throwing up their hands and giving up on surveys? Just find a bunch of standardized tools, and then you never have to write your own survey ever again. Yep, so be clear about the research question that your survey is trying to answer. Reflect on your survey response options, especially in light of the issues that we've raised today, and just kind of query them and make sure that there's no massively red flags. Make sure that the data you get at the end is going to be able to be analysed in a way that answers your study aim or research question or evaluation aim, whatever you want to call it. And make sure that the survey is appropriate for the population that you're surveying as well. We set the slides around, we can send them around again, but it's just some resources that I quickly put together that might help you with locating some tools, and then also use some resources to use for actually creating your own surveys as well. But we'll send this around. And then, wait, there's more. We've got 3 more workshops coming up over the next 3 months. We've got one on introduction to REDCap. So the way that we structured these workshops, we tried to make it kind of logical. So this is just the kind of introductory, how to do a survey. Next is how to actually build a survey using REDCap. And then the third one is, well, once we've extracted our data from REDCap, how can we visually present it in tables and figures in a way that answers our question. And then last, we're doing a hepatitis C surveillance sort of workshop webinar where we're going to talk about how notification data can be used in surveillance, and then also how sentinel surveillance can be used in monitoring disease incidence and prevalence, and also informing clinical care. On your screen as well, we've got some evaluation questions. I will not answer them, I think. But if I did,
you, Josh, you shouldn't be allowed to answer them.
If I were to answer them, I'd probably say, no, I'm not going to be leading. Anyway, great. So yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Once you've answered the questions, also feel